On the island of Fera, which is the modern-day island of Santorini, we find beautiful murals that adorned the architecture of the ancient city of Aquitini. And remember, Aquitini is the city that was buried by volcanic ash. And so we have these murals that come to us in pretty remarkable condition, and we can get a sense of what Minoan art really looked like. These fresco paintings usually had a geometric border, and we can see a remnant of that here, and depicted either landscapes or humans interacting with the landscape. The frescoes were created with two different methods. Either buon fresco, which is wet plaster painting, or fresco a secco, which is dry plaster painting. And these are the Italian terms that refer to the different types of fresco painting. Buon fresco painting is painting pigment directly on wet plaster. And the benefit of this technique is that it's extremely durable, because when you paint a water-based pigment on wet plaster, a chemical bond happens when it dries. And so it is extremely durable, and the only way to destroy this is to really chip the painting off the wall. The disadvantage of this is that you have to work very quickly because the plaster dries. So you can only work on small segments at a time. The other method is fresco a secco, which is dry painting. And this is essentially painting with pigment on dry plaster. This has the benefit of being able to, you could work on it for a long period of time and add to it. However, it is not as durable. The color can chip off very easily. In Aquitini, we see both of these methods used, and sometimes a combination of both. In the last video, you saw a fresco of the landscape. And I'll be talking about a different type of fresco also found in Aquitini, in which we see figures interacting with the landscape. In both frescoes, I think you can see that the Minoans loved color. And so we see these bright, vibrant colors used, created with natural pigments. We also see that the figures and forms tended to be created with a strong outline, where we can see a strong outline of the figure. And then that outline was then filled in with flat blocks of color, unshaded flat color. So we see that here is the red, or kind of a rusty color, and then another section which is also outlined with black, we see blue. But there's very little shading or highlights that show depth or mass or volume. This fresco is called the Crocus Gatherers, and we see two young women who are in the process of gathering the saffron stems from crocuses. Here I'm showing you a detail of the figure on the right. And I think we can make some pretty interesting comparisons between this Minoan figure and how the Egyptians portrayed the human figure. First of all, like the Egyptians, we see the figure in profile with a frontal eye. But unlike the Egyptians, we see someone who is very active and dynamic and interacting with nature. Egyptian figures tended to be composite views, a profile head and a frontal body, but very static. And if they were making any moves at all, it was one extremely purposeful and awkward step forward. Here we see a figure that is definitely in motion in a very fluid and dynamic way. And perhaps I should walk you through the figure. She is in a hilly landscape, and we can see the outline of the landscape. You'll notice it is not a flat ground line, but rather a sloping ground line. She has one leg that is sort of lodged in a valley, and then her leg behind her is coming up and stepping on sort of a rocky cliff. So she is not just walking, but climbing. Her two arms are also on different levels. Her back arm is picking these little crocus saffron fronds, and the other hand seems to have these purple fronds gripped around her hand, although it's hard to see because there is so much lost here. Her clothes hug her body in such a way that we can see this movement, and we can even see a bit of her bare ankle here with an anklet around it. We can also see how her costume is affected by her movements. We see these kind of bangles that are moving with her. Her ponytail is kind of flying a little bit in the wind. And we see her pants leg, or her skirt, that is moving with her legs. So this artist, this Minoan artist, is interested in observing a body in motion and understanding how that motion affects the world around them. And as we saw even in the last lecture, looking at the landscape, they are interested in observing nature and depicting nature. Even though it's very stylized, we definitely have some observation of landscape and plants and animals. Now, this fresco was found in a room at Akwatiri that we think was used for puberty rites. And so it was a space that was meant to celebrate the transition of girls into womanhood. So why do we have a scene of crocus gatherers or saffron gatherers in this space? Saffron is a precious spice. It's collected from the crocus, and it was used for dye to create kind of a very vibrant yellow dye, also for food, and also a medicinal use for menstrual cramps. And so this last use implies that it would be an appropriate ritual. Gathering saffron leaves would be an appropriate ritual for puberty rites. She's wearing a costume that is somewhat reminiscent of the woman with snakes. And remember, we saw kind of a flouncy skirt with lots of layers of fabric, this diamond pattern that is on the apron, and an exposed bodice. Here we can see that this girl has an exposed bodice, an open shirt, short sleeves, a cinched waist with a kind of a corset or a belt, and then that diamond pattern also appears on her. We see a layered skirt, and it seems here much more fluid than in the snake goddess, but we can see a very similar kind of costume. She also has this very interesting ponytail that is similar to the boys boxing that we saw in the previous video, in which a child would have a shaved head, but some of the hair would be left to grow to give these kind of ponytails. And she might be in a particular moment in her life as she's transitioning from girlhood to womanhood, in which that shaved part of her head is starting to grow, because after she moves into adulthood, her hair would be allowed to grow out. She's dressed very nicely for going out to pick flowers. She's wearing not just a beautiful dress, but also jewelry with bangles. Notice that little anklet and bracelets. She probably is not just out for a daily harvest, but rather as a ritual scene. we see her performing some kind of ceremonial or ritual rite connected with puberty.